Slavery and its history today feels like taboo in discussions. It is one of the avoided things to talk about at this time. We cannot also deny that slavery has been around in different types of ethnicity and countries, many of which are often forgotten, and much worse, suppressed. Today on History in Minutes, we'll be diving deeper into the real history of the white slave trade. The narrative of slavery is more intricate than what has been presented to you. Were you aware that North Africa received up to 1.25 million white slaves? Did you know that 1/5 of the 1797 US government budget was used to pay tribute to North African Muslim nations to free and halt the enslavement of Americans? The Ottoman Empire enslaved millions of Europeans, and in ancient Briton, slavery was so pervasive that the term Briton was used interchangeably with slave in Anglo-Saxon language. Additionally, owning and trading slaves was a worldwide practice. It's important to acknowledge these facts and reconsider our connection to history and its aftermath. The scourge of slavery affected individuals in nearly every culture, region, and era of history. Although the term slave often conjures thoughts of the atrocities committed during the transatlantic slave trade, the practice of enslaving human beings was common in both ancient and modern times and persists to this day. Presently, the estimated number of individuals enduring enslavement ranges from 38 million to 46 million, highlighting the ongoing nature of this abhorrent practice. The focus of societal scrutiny and censure has been primarily centered on the devastating African slave trade that occurred between the 16th and 19th centuries. Regrettably, an equally reprehensible trade in Barbary, slaves existed concurrently in the Mediterranean region. This insidious trade involved Barbary corsairs, and it is believed that they enslaved up to 1.25 million Europeans. These individuals, who have since become recognized as the white slaves of Barbary, were subject to lives of comparable wretchedness to their African counterparts. The Barbary slaves were a group of people who were captured and enslaved by Barbary pirates operating in the Mediterranean Sea and along the North African coast between the 16th and 19th centuries. These pirates, who were primarily from the North African countries of Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and Libya, targeted ships from Europe and the Americas, as well as coastal towns and villages in search of plunder and captives to sell into slavery. The Barbary pirates were able to capture slaves from a wide range of ethnic and religious backgrounds, including Europeans, Africans, and Middle Easterners. Some of the most famous examples of Barbary slaves were Europeans from countries such as Italy, Spain, and Ireland, who were captured while sailing or living along the Mediterranean coast. The corsairs, who were very unsatisfied with their scopes of capture, not only targeted ships and sailors, but also frequently raided coastal settlements in several European countries, including Italy, France, Spain, Portugal, England, Ireland, the Netherlands, and even as far away as Iceland. These attacks were carried out by landing on unguarded beaches and sneaking up on villages under cover of darkness to capture their victims. One particularly devastating attack took place in 1631, when almost all of the inhabitants of the village of Baltimore in Ireland were taken by the corsairs in this way. The threat of such raids led to widespread fear and panic among coastal communities, and many towns were almost completely abandoned by their inhabitants until the 19th century. The corsairs' raids had a significant impact on social and economic development of coastal regions in the Mediterranean, as well as on the cultural heritage of affected communities. The fear of being captured and enslaved caused many people to abandon their homes and flee inland, leaving behind empty towns and villages that were vulnerable to further attacks. The impact of the corsairs' raids was not limited to the Mediterranean, however. Coastal communities in other parts of Europe were also affected, and the threat of piracy led to the development of coastal defense and an establishment of naval patrols to protect ships in coastal towns. The Barbary corsairs' raid on the coastal village of Baltimore in Ireland is widely regarded as one of the most brutal and heinous acts committed by these pirates. In the early hours of June 20th, 1631, more than 200 corsairs arrived on the shores of Baltimore, armed with a variety of weapons including muskets, iron bars, and burning sticks. The corsairs silently made their way to cottages and homes along the shoreline and in the main village, waiting outside the front doors until a signal was given. Then they stormed into the homes, seizing the unsuspecting inhabitants from their beds. Men, women, and children, numbering 107 in total, were dragged onto ships and taken back to Algiers. Upon their arrival, the residents of Baltimore were taken to slave pens where they were chained and nearly naked and paraded before prospective buyers. Men were typically forced to work as laborers, while women were often used as concubines. Children were often raised as Muslims and incorporated into the slave corps within the Ottoman army. During the 13th and 14th centuries, the Mediterranean was dominated by Christian pirates, mainly hailing from Catalonia and Sicily, who posed a significant threat to merchants traversing the seas. However, the situation changed in the 15th century with the expansion of the Ottoman Empire, which marked the beginning of the rise of Barbary corsairs as a threat to Christian shipping. By the 16th century, the Barbary corsairs had established themselves as a force to be reckoned with, preying on the ships of the Mediterranean powers, including Venice, Spain, and France. However, it was not until the arrival of European pirates in the early 17th century that the corsairs were able to expand their operations beyond the Mediterranean. The European pirates brought with them the advanced sailing and shipbuilding techniques that enabled the Barbary corsairs to extend their activities into the Atlantic Ocean. This resulted in the corsairs being able to target ships from countries such as England, Ireland, Portugal, and the Netherlands, which were now within their reach. The common story surrounding the Barbary slave trade often portrays Muslim corsairs capturing white Christian victims. However, this portrayal is too simplistic and does not reflect the reality of the situation. The corsairs were not motivated by race or religious orientation of those they captured, as slaves in Barbary were of all different races and religions, including black, brown, white, Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, Jewish, or Muslim. Furthermore, the corsairs themselves were not solely Muslim. English privateers and Dutch captains also took part in the slave trade, exploiting the political instability of the time, in which alliances and enemies could change quickly. Robert Davis, a historian and author of Christian Slaves, Muslim Masters, White Slavery in the Mediterranean, the Barbary Coast, and Italy, notes that the idea that slavery was always racial in nature is a false one. Slavery in Barbary was not solely based on race, but rather on the demand for labor and the capture of people through piracy. Davis also argues that the history of white slavery has been overlooked or minimized by scholars who prefer to view Europeans as colonial oppressors rather than the victims of slavery. This perspective may be controversial, but it highlights the complexity of the Barbary slave trade and the need for a more nuanced understanding of its history. The Barbary slave trade was a brutal and dehumanizing system that subjected captured individuals to horrific treatment. Many slaves did not survive the long voyage back to North Africa due to disease, malnutrition, and the lack of water. Those who did survive were taken to the slave markets, where they were put on display for buyers to inspect before being sold at auction. Once purchased, slaves were put to work in various ways depending on their gender and physical condition. Men were often assigned to work hard manual labor, such as working in quarries or heavy construction. Women were used for domestic work or sexual servitude. At night, slaves were confined to bangios, which were overcrowded and often unbearably hot. Perhaps the most harrowing fate for a Barbary slave was being assigned to man the oars of galleys. Rowers were shackled in place and never allowed to leave their seat. They ate, slept, defecated, and urinated in the same position, often for months or even years on end. Overseers would beat slaves with a whip to keep them rowing, and anyone deemed not to be working hard enough would be brutally punished. The system of Barbary slaves was designed to strip individuals of their humanity, reducing them to nothing more than property to be bought and sold. The conditions were inhumane and degrading, and the suffering endured by the slaves was immense. As the 17th century drew to a close, the power of the Barbary pirates began to dwindle as European navies became more powerful and started to retaliate against their attacks on merchant ships. However, it wasn't until the 19th century that a more coordinated effort was made to quell the pirates' activities. The United States of America and some European nations began to take a more aggressive action against the Barbary pirates. Algiers, the main base of the corsairs, was frequently bombarded by the French, Spanish, and the Americans. The Anglo-Dutch raid in 1816 on Algiers was particularly significant, as it forced the corsairs to agree to terms which included the enslavement of Christians. Despite this, the slave trade of non-Europeans was allowed to continue. Even after these efforts, occasional incidents of piracy still occurred. The British launched another raid on Algiers in 1824, and the French eventually invaded Algiers in 1830, placing it under colonial rule. Similarly, Tunisia was invaded by France in 1881, and Tripoli fell into Italian hands in the 1911 Italo-Turkish War. It wasn't until European governments passed laws granting emancipation to slaves that the practice of slavery finally ceased on the Barbary Coast. The slave trade, which had been a thriving industry for centuries, was officially ended, and the remaining slaves were granted their freedom. This was a significant step towards the fight against slavery and the protection of human rights. Today, the memory of the Barbary slaves serves as a reminder of the horrors of slavery and the importance of the continuing efforts to eradicate it. That's it for today's video. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you learned something new. We'll see you next time for more History in Minutes.